Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Resilience Hub. I'm Sara Pantulian, I'm the Chief Executive at ODI, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to our expert discussion tonight to really try and discuss together how we can make sure that we can better help people that are affected by conflict, people that live in context of fragilities, to adapt to climate variability and change. We really want to use, this hour and a half together here in this, very important part of the COP setup. Right at the beginning of what is a momentous, COP, to take stock of the collective experience, to really try and support communities that face, this double challenge of adapting to climate while living in context of deep fragility or, in conflict situations. But also really think about some concrete steps that we can take together, to catalyze better support to communities that are exposed to conflict and fragility and have to face the challenge of climate change. We have a wonderful panel of incredible experts, both in the room and online, who will help us with the reflections, to think about what we've done so far, but what we can do, even better going forward. I'll introduce them one by one as they take the floor, and then we'll have an opportunity to also talk together about reflecting on, our collective experience and making some commitments about how we can improve action in with an accelerated pace. But before I introduce you to our discussion, it's really my privilege to invite His Excellency Alambeji Abba Issa, the Minister of Agriculture of Niger, to open the discussion by giving us some, real, very direct experience of these challenges, the context of Niger, combining this dual challenge of responding to climate change, risks while also navigating the challenges of climate and of fragility and conflict. The minister will speak in French, but is ably aided by our colleague Monsieur Amadou, who will help with the translation. Monsieur le ministre, c'est un plaisir d'avoir vous entre nous ce soir. On va écouter avec beaucoup d'intérêt.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la présentatrice. Avant d'aborder le sujet, j'aimerais remercier le gouvernement britannique qui nous a donné cette opportunité de parler d'un pays spécifique, le Niger, qui est sous l'œil du cyclone du changement climatique.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I will try to do my best to at least let you have the message that the minister wants to convey to you. I'm not an interpreter, an official interpreter, but I will try my best. So, His Excellency, the Minister for Agriculture from Niger, is first of all happy to be here with you today to talk about climate change and the effect of climate change on a country like Niger, a Sahelian country. And you also thank the British government for organizing this event. Actually, he's very happy to be among you today. Thank you.
Ainsi, mon intervention va comprendre 4 ou 5 parties. La première, c'est que les gaz à effet de serre produits par des pays industrialisés essentiellement ont provoqué l'effet de serre.
Yeah, first of all, I will say that the greenhouse effect actually produced by industries in developed countries is actually the cause of most of climate challenges today.
Et le changement climatique affecte l'un des continents du monde qui produit le moins de gaz, qui est l'Afrique.
And this climate, let's say this pollution actually produced by industries in developed countries affects countries like our country, like Niger, who produce less, who are less industrialized actually.
Et en Afrique, les pays du Sahel sont les plus touchés, comme le Niger.
And in Africa, Sahelian countries like Niger are the most affected by the effect of climate change today.
Le changement climatique cause des effets au Niger tels que
Climate change causes various effects on the Nigerian
l'augmentation de la température, ça c'est pour le monde entier,
the temperature rise,
la rareté des pluies ou l'irrégularité et la fréquence des sécheresses,
reduction of rainfall, droughts,
la dégradation des terres,
degradation of agricultural soils,
la diminution des pâturages,
the diminution of livestock grazing,
et en conséquence la réduction des productions agricoles,
so the reduction of production in terms of agricultural and in terms of livestock.
et enfin, comme résultat, l'appauvrissement des populations.
And the approvement of the population.
Cela a trois effets sur le Niger.
This has three major effects. on
Le
the
Niger est un pays fragile.
Niger is a fragile country.
Le Niger est un pays où il y a des conflits d'accès aux ressources.
Where we have conflict over access to resources, especially natural resources.
Et nous avons enfin le plus grand des conflits, le conflit lié au terrorisme qui recrute nos jeunes pauvres.
The Republic of Niger also faces a problem in terms of security, instability, terrorism.
Donc le Niger a ces trois situations avec des solutions plus ou moins différentes.
So Niger faces at least these three different problems.
En tant que pays fragile,
As a fragile country,
nous devons premièrement, comme nous l'avons dit, augmenter la production agricole, nous adapter.
we have to increase agricultural production.
Et pour ce faire, il faut recourir à l'eau de surface, mais surtout à l'eau souterraine pour l'irrigation.
So if we are to achieve, let's say, our objectives, so we need water at the surface, the rainwater,
Et l'eau souterraine,
and
underground water.
and ground, let's say groundwater.
Mais l'irrigation doit être faite avec, pour exploiter une situation, c'est peut-être une mesure d'atténuation, avec l'énergie solaire.
We have to develop the solar energy and use it in irrigation.
Et deuxièmement, nous devons utiliser des techniques d'irrigation qui consomment moins d'eau, telles que le goutte à goutte.
So we have to use irrigation techniques that needs less water.
Drip irrigation. Yeah, we have to. Et pour les pâturages, nous devons aller vers la production des pâturages.
And for livestock forage, we have to go through, let's say, growing forage.
Pour les agriculteurs, après l'irrigation, il y a les semences adaptées au climat.
For agriculture, for agriculture, we need seeds.
Nous demandons la formation des producteurs à des techniques avancées.
Yeah, we need the training of those those in agriculture industries and others. We need them to be really trained so that they can have techniques, advanced techniques that will help them produce more.
Et enfin, nous devons essentiellement recourir à des techniques qui causent le moins de conflits.
We also have to make sure the techniques we are using will not cause conflicts between communities.
La deuxième situation, c'est la situation de conflits d'accès aux ressources.
So conflict over access to resources.
Le premier cas, c'est l'accès aux sous-produits agricoles
Yeah, access to
par les éleveurs.
conflicts over access to agricultural products
Par les éleveurs.
by the cow, let's say
Et en général, il y a un conflit entre les agriculteurs et les éleveurs pour l'accès aux sous-produits.
So there are conflict between communities, between agriculture, those producing and those that have livestock.
Et pour réduire ces conflits,
Pastoralists, yeah.
et pour réduire ces conflits,
And to reduce those conflicts,
il faut faire le passage, les couloirs de passage.
we have to have corridors.
Nous avons des conflits liés au point d'eau par les éleveurs.
We have conflict over water points.
Et pour réduire ces conflits, il faut multiplier les points d'eau.
So to reduce these conflicts, so we have to increase water points.
Nous avons un troisième type de conflit d'accès à la terre par les agriculteurs.
Yeah,
Parce que la
we
terre est
have-
réduite.
We have conflict over access to agricultural land.
Excusez-moi, monsieur le ministre, il faut qu'on commence le reste de la discussion.
Excuse-moi.
Il faut
Accélérer.
il faut
Accélérer.
Voilà.
Ok. Donc, conflit d'accès à la terre par les agriculteurs.
Conflict over access to agricultural land.
Pour résoudre ça, il faut intensifier l'agriculture.
We have to intensify agriculture.
Enfin, le conflit lié au terrorisme.
Yeah, and the conflict, let's say conflicts related to terrorism.
Le Niger fait face à 2 foyers de terrorisme, au lac Tchad et au Mali.
Niger Republic faces 2 different fronts in terms of terrorism. That means you
Boko
have
Haram
the Nigerian border and the Malian border.
Et cela a provoqué beaucoup de déplacements des populations.
Yeah, and that creates really a kind of transhumance. Let's say people have to leave their areas, their villages,
Et c'est là où les humanitaires interviennent le plus
and that's where we need humanitarian intervention
pour régler les problèmes de l'eau,
to settle the issue of
le
water,
problème de l'alimentation,
the issue of food,
le problème de cuisson.
yes, of food, and
Pour régler le problème de l'eau, il faut faire des forages. Et les forages avec les pompes solaires.
we have to create forage with solar energy.
Pour la cuisson, on a utilisé le plus le gaz à la place du bois pour lutter contre la déforestation.
For cooking, we are now using gas instead of firewood.
Et pour l'alimentation, nous faisons la culture de maraîchère.
And to make sure we increase food, we have the practice of, let's say, gardening. So we have
En conclusion, le Niger est un pays fragile.
to round up, Niger is a fragile country.
Le Niger est un pays soumis à des conflits d'accès aux ressources.
Niger is facing conflicts over access
Le
to
Niger est un
natural
pays
resources.
qui fait face au terrorisme.
Niger is facing terrorism.
Et aujourd'hui, le gouvernement du Niger a mis en place une stratégie 3N qui contient la résilience.
So today, Niger has a program that is called 3N. That's Nigerians feed Nigerians.
Et dans ce programme, nous avons le volet résilience. C'est pourquoi nous appelons tous les humanitaires à s'inscrire dans ce programme pour aider le Niger.
And in this program, we are calling all the humanitarians to come and help Niger to achieve its objectives.
Merci beaucoup, mesdames
Thank
et
you
messieurs.
very much.
Merci beaucoup, merci beaucoup. Monsieur Amadou, and merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre. There was one very important thing at the end the Minister said that didn't quite come through in the translation, that what Niger needs more than anything is support for its resilience work, for its resilience program. And I think that's really at the heart of the discussion tonight, as the Minister very well emphasized. We all facing the impact of climate change, of course, the frequency, the intensity, the duration, the timing, the location of slow and sudden onset climate-related hazards are going to impact on all of us. But there are some places where this impact is going to be much deeper, and very clearly, Niger is one of these places where you're going to have a real double whammy in terms of all the complexity on the conflict side, on the terrorism, on the violence, on the climatic pressures. We know that there has been a lot of effort, of course, to try and offer financial commitment towards resilience. If you just look in the context of the SDGs, but also the Paris Agreement, there is financial support, but it's definitely not adequate and definitely doesn't go all the way to support those who are impacted the most, and definitely countries in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa are amongst those that are really at the worst end of this impact. And so there is a real urgency in trying to think how we can, increase, improve access, particularly to adaptation finance, because we have a real, finance gap. But we also have an action gap. It's not just money. Money itself, money alone is not going to solve the problem. I really like the emphasis that the minister put on the fact that there is a lot of humanitarian response going on in Niger, but actually what we need is a focus on resilience and being, a humanitarian at heart and someone who has worked in humanitarian response for a very long time myself. I know how, humanitarians who are those who very much find themselves in the heart of, crisis like the one that Niger faces, very often find that, humanitarian means urgent response. And it's actually not true. 80% of humanitarian response happens in protracted crisis, in crises that actually span a very long time frame. And the importance of focusing on anticipatory, and if you want, preparedness, programming, and building the long-term resilience is so critical. So we want to really make sure that we learn a little bit about those who are trying to do more to really link, this humanitarian response in this context in terms of understanding how we can reduce losses to help strengthen the capacities of communities for tomorrow's crisis. And who better to help us than, I hope is going to appear on screen, Robert Mardini, who is the Director General of the Icrc. Rob, are you there?
Yes, I can hear you well, Sarah.
Great.
Good to see you.
We can't see you, but oh yeah, here you
go
are. Hi, Robert. Great. So, Robert, you heard, how important it is, and you know that very well, of course, to try and make sure that our humanitarian response are not blind to the longer-term challenges, particularly those related to climate crisis. What are you seeing in your operations? What is the Icrc learning from your own response and the response of others that we can take home with us tonight?
Thank you, Sarah. Well, I think we all agree with the problem analysis. And I'm just back from Mali, where, as you say, protracted conflict and growing climate crisis are pushing people really to the brink. In Mopti, for instance, I spoke with many people in camps and in hospitals who had been displaced multiple times due to violence, but also to increasingly erratic weather that is more and more visible in a place like Mali. Desertification is really visible. What we see in so many places is clear. People affected by armed conflict and violence are the same ones on the front line of the climate crisis, and they are at a massive disadvantage when it comes to adapting to climate change. The reasons are obvious: weakened institutions and essential services, poor economies, lack of social cohesion, and reversal of development gains are the most obvious ones. And the result is that some 60% of the 25 countries considered today the most vulnerable and least ready to adapt to climate change are actually also affected by an armed conflict. So the convergence of climate risk, environmental degradation, and conflict has grave humanitarian consequences. It really threatens people's life and health and worsens food, economic, and water insecurity. And now, on top of this, conflicts themselves can damage the natural environment, and this further reduces people's resilience to climate change. So greater respect for international humanitarian law rules that protect the natural environment can limit its degradation. This in turn reduces the harm and the risks that conflict-affected communities endure day in and day out. So for now, climate action and finance are particularly weak in places of conflict because of the challenges attached to implementing long-term plans in unstable environments. So the question is, how can humanitarian programs contribute to climate adaptation, as you rightly put it, Sarah? And I think that humanitarian actors by now agree that our programs must not only respond to emergency needs, but also contribute to strengthening people's resilience to future shocks, and also at the same time to reduce their exposure to risk. We have traditionally had a much narrower focus on saving lives, which is of course essential and important, but as crises are often long-lasting, quick fixes are no longer enough. So for instance, when it comes to Icrc and the work of the Malian Red Cross, in several countries in the Sahel, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, we provide emergency food support when necessary, but we also help farmers and herders cope with increasing climate variability by supporting, for instance, the rehabilitation of irrigation schemes and the production of animal feed or seed and its storage. We also distribute, for instance, seeds that are resistant to drought. It is in recognition of this role that we have been working to steer and galvanize also humanitarian action in the face of climate and environmental crises. The Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations that was launched in May and now been signed by more than 170 humanitarian organizations is a testimony to that. We've been joining also forces with key stakeholders. These include communities, the states, development actors, IFIs such as the World Bank, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, of course, researchers, to call for stronger climate action in fragile settings. We have also been exploiting what practices work in such environment and how to unlock climate finance. Comprehensive climate adaptation is really fundamentally linked to inclusive development. The development actor is well advanced in its integration of climate-related considerations, yet it really struggles to develop comprehensive and long-term responses in the very places that are enduring conflict and violence, particularly when the government is not able to deliver enough services to its population, or is simply absent from part of the territory. Mali is a case in point where 70% of the territory is not controlled today by the government. And there are millions of people across the world who live in such situations. A couple of weeks ago, we had a rich discussion on addressing gaps in climate finance in such environments with a number of the institutions around the table today. For us, the bottom line is that we really need to come together and make this work. The international community has committed to leaving no one behind, right? Well, this includes people affected by conflict and violence who should be really top of the list. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Robert. And I'm, really delighted to hear that there is, more concrete commitment, progress to try and make sure that we start breaking down these silos, and also in the humanitarian community we take the resilience challenge, the climate adaptation challenge really seriously. But to make sure that that succeeds, we need to make sure that this is framed the right way. And so it's important to also learn from those who have focused on adaptation programming for a long time, which is why I want to come to Mikko Likainen, who is the manager of the Adaptation Fund, because you've been at it for a long time. As the humanitarian community may be starting to finally engage with the challenge. Now, what can we learn from the last 10 years of adaptation programming, Mikko?
Thank you. Can you hear me with this microphone? I need to use this one. Okay, thank you. Can you hear me better now? Great. Okay, it's very nice to be here, and it's actually a very historical day for the Adaptation Fund today. We've been working for 12 years, and today, for the first time, we received announcements of support from two countries that have never supported. The United States, President Biden announced his pledge to the Adaptation Fund, and also Prime Minister Trudeau from Canada did the same. So we are very happy today, and great to be here. Thank you, ODI, for inviting us. So we, of course, need resources to be able to support developing countries in their adaptation needs, including their in those in conflict situations. Many of the lessons that we've learned on what works in adaptation are the same in non-conflict and conflict types of situations, but there are specific challenges that conflict and vulnerable countries face. We support adaptation through grant funding without a requirement for co-financing, for projects that have immediate adaptation benefits that are replicable and that are scalable, and that produce lessons learned for the wider adaptation community. In the big picture, there's increasing focus on providing funding in other forms through loans and by participation of the private sector. But the reality is that in many parts of the world, communities live in situations where it's not possible to take loans or to have private sector investment in any large scale, and because of that, and this is very, very true in conflict-prone situations because of the difficulty of investment in such cases. Sorry, there's a little bit, I'm trying to put my microphone in a place where there's less interference. Thank you. In fragile and conflict situations, the adaptation approaches have often been not paid enough attention. Most of the actors are humanitarian and specialized United Nations agencies, and the focus is often on the short-term relief for the post-conflict situation. There is a need for better understanding of climate adaptation in those types of contexts, and to reconcile the two types of expertise on adaptation and on working in conflict situations. There's also better understanding needed on constraints on finance in those kinds of situations. In situations of conflict, capacity building is really the key, as was mentioned already earlier, and it's often not seen as a priority with the shorter-term goals. There's often a race to post-conflict recovery and focus on quick solutions and not necessarily on how to institutionalize and build longer-term capacity. Early-stage project development and vulnerability needs assessment is often almost inexistent. And when prioritized and funded, capacity development is also left to external partners and not necessarily well-structured, and that may undermine the principle of country ownership, which is very important in adaptation. In conflict situations, one of the challenges is changes in government, though that's a challenge in other situations as well, but particularly in relation to conflict, as capacity that has been vested in certain government institution or even individuals suddenly changes, and then it needs to start from scratch, and that of course is a serious setback in terms of building longer term capacity. There is a need to streamline the access modalities for climate finance in fragile countries. We've done that with small island developing states and least developed countries, but there so far hasn't been adequate attention to looking at fragile situations, and that's clearly an area where we should pay more attention to how to assist countries and regions with conflict to access funding more easily. And finally, I would just like to mention that in this political process in which we are now in the UNFCCC, there is a specific focus on certain types of vulnerable groups, such as least developed countries and small island developing states, but fragile countries are not yet enshrined in this process in a similar way, and maybe that's an area of development for the political process to consider. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikko. So yes, we're hearing is there's a lot of very siloed response. And I think part of the problem actually comes from the fact that it's the conceptualization of risk that is a problem, because these are complex but interrelated risks and are very often taken in isolation from one another. So actually on that I'm going to bring in Rebecca Nadine, who is the director of the Global Risk and Resilience team at ODI. That's something you write a lot about, Rebecca, so tell us more how you see the problem.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, I think, as His Excellency the Minister pointed out, we're talking not just about climate change here, but we're talking about other threats. And climate change is a driver of existing vulnerabilities. And I think so often, particularly donor programming, is really just focused on single hazards. It's focused on single threats. And actually there needs to be a much more open acknowledgement that you cannot just do a programming that's just addressing climate change. You need to be considering the wider political economy in which you're trying to implement these programs to understand how these different threats are intersecting. And I think it's also tremendously important to actually be, for the donors and the financing, to really be hearing from the countries. So we heard from His Excellency actually the priorities are climate change impacts, it's conflict over resources, and it's terrorism. So when we're hearing those priorities from the countries, we can't just be dismissing those and saying, right, we're just going to implement a climate adaptation program, that's it. And I think the other important point to note is that we need to make sure that we are not embedding further risk into some of the interventions. So, for example, we're not creating maladaptation. And I think this is particularly important when it comes to areas, as the Minister mentioned, around pastoralists, access to land, the importance of developing corridors, so that actually you know, if we're going to put in a microsolar field somewhere, that you're not actually putting that into contested lands, so that we're not just focused solely on one problem. We're actually understanding, as I say, that wider political economy.
Thanks, Rebecca. So one organization that's tried to focus on, you know, looking how to rethink risk in fragile and conflict context over the past few years has been the World Bank. So I want to bring in Sukaina Kane, who is the Director of Fragility, Conflict and Vulnerability at the World Bank, to really hear from your experience, Sukaina, of, you know, trying to develop conflict-sensitive approaches to adaptation. And while we bring you on screen, I'm going to invite those who are standing at the back to come and fill the few chairs that are here, so you don't have to stand until the end of the event. But can we have Sukaina on screen?
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Sarah. I'm very pleased to participate to this important discussion. So as building on what the previous speakers have said, right, let me start by saying that the relationship between the climate-related risk, the conflict, is complex. And it often interconnects with political, social, economic, security, and demographic factors, as it has been stated. Where you have climate change interacts with other social, economic, and environmental pressures, compound risks emerge that can increase vulnerability, exacerbate grievance, as it was said by the minister, between agriculture, and pastors, for instance, and deepen the pre-existing fragility. And conversely, conflict prevention and addressing the root cause of fragility can serve as an essential enabler of climate adaptation. So climate change also increases the risk of internal displacement, distress-driven migration, and instability. Without concrete actions on climate and development, we estimate that by 2050, as many as 143 million people could become climate migrants in 3 major regions of the world, namely Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. So we have also noticed, Sarah, that compounding shocks further stretch and strain the already weak capacity, and this has been mentioned as well, the weak capacity of governments in fragile and conflict-affected settings with potentially damaging impact. So the state institutions, they find it very challenging to mount a strong response to crises, to cushion the impact on the most vulnerable population, as well as to invest in long-term conflict prevention and climate adaptation. Thus, the FCV countries run into deeper danger of being trapped in a vicious circle of instability if they fail to adapt to the effects of climate change. So the climate change, in our view, in many fragile and conflict-affected settings vary greatly by location. So there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Climate adaptation measures then should be tailored to the country and local conditions, including specific vulnerabilities. Getting back to the issues that was raised both by the minister from Niger and emphasized, I think it was by the previous speaker. I think it's, yes, was the previous speaker. I'm sorry, forgot, didn't mention her, didn't know her name. So I was saying that at the World Bank we have, taking into account 2 things, not only it's not one size fits all solution, but some of the solutions should be regional. So for instance, for the pastoralism, those corridors to allow the pastors to find a way and mitigate the risk of conflict. We do have a regional project for the Sahel which include building those corridors, but as well having those water access that was mentioned as a great source. So the convergence of natural disasters and armed conflict in conflict or post-conflict settings present particular challenges. The consideration of climate adaptation is likely to be crowded out by urgent focuses on security, for instance. And yet, in divided communities, climate change presents an opportunity to unite against a common threat. In this context, then, the need for adaptation offers an incentive for cooperation in our view. And when delivered effectively, adaptation in FCV settings can serve to promote factors that strengthen resilience, improve livelihood opportunities, and reduce drivers related to conflict. And I would just like to take this opportunity to say that at the World Bank, we do not look at it as a one risk. You know, we look at the compound risk, and we have several analytical instruments that we can talk about later as to taking a holistic view on those risks. So my last point is that conflict-sensitive practices are needed for an effective adaptation, because conflict drives vulnerability and undercut really the adaptive capacity. So when we do what we call a conflict-sensitive adaptation, it helps guard against exacerbating factors that contribute to conflict. And as such, it helps to actively promote factors that build peace and improve livelihood opportunities, because as Robert mentioned, it's about protecting lives, but it's about protecting livelihoods and the future as well. So it needs to form a cornerstone of adaptation policy. In a worst case scenario, failure to do so can lead to maladaptation, as was mentioned earlier, by increasing the vulnerability of marginalized groups, either now or in the future. So to conclude, I really hope that events like this will help us to create a greater sense and a greater connection between the communities working on climate adaptation, FCV, risk financing, and others. It's only when we come together to tackle a complex and multifaceted challenge like addressing climate change in FCV settings that we have any chance of bringing about meaningful and lasting change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sakina. So everything I'm hearing tonight, unsurprisingly, is that yes, there is a little bit of an effort, you know, to get beyond, and we've been discussing that for possibly the past 20 years, if not more. My PhD was on adaptation. I started in 1995. That probably betrays my age. So these are debates that are not new. But to be honest, I think what doesn't really change, which gets in the way, is our operational frameworks. Is the fact that we have language, terminology that is very different, that is separate depending which part of the international system you work in. We don't really have coordinated analysis. All of this leads to a really compartmentalized approach. And even the international agreements. If you look at international frameworks, Sendai doesn't really talk about conflict and fragility. Even there we've got a problem in terms of the lack of recognition of these interrelated risks. So we've heard about the importance of actually starting from the priorities of the country. So I'm going to come to Ahmed Yusuf Ahmed, who is the Director General of the Director of Environment and Climate Change in the Federal Government of Somalia, to ask you, Ahmed, from the perspective of a government like Somalia that has similar compounded challenges like in Niger in terms of the exposure to climate risk, to violence, to conflict. How do you bring this coordination together? How can while at the international level we're still somehow linked or shackled to our different frameworks and different operational points of reference, how can a country like Somalia really drive that collaboration and this further sort of integration of approaches that is required?
Thank you, Sarah, ODI, and I thank the panelists, and also I thank the participants and people who attended this important event. I think I can say that today's event is very important, and the topic which is addressing climate risks in the context of fragility and the conflict areas is very important to talk such kind of these events. In Somalia, as you know, it's a country which locates in East Africa or Horn of Africa, and it's a country which almost more than 25 years used to experience a long-term political instability, where we had some challenges on political issues and disagreements, and that has been caused to do not do more when it comes to the environment and climate change. But for the last 10 years, you see that the country is coming back and institutions are rebuilding, and it coming back to the arena. And I think that's the one important issue that I want to share with the team. Coming back to your question, Sarah, regarding on the level of coordination and collaboration required to formulate policies in every fragile settings. The nature of climate change calls for extensive cooperation and collaboration, and also the responses at the national and international levels. At the national level, the federal government of Somalia and federal member states, because our country uses a system which is called federalism, where we have a federal government of national government, but we have also more than 6 federal member states. So there has to be always collaboration between all those government structures, starting from the federal government and also federal member states. So the federal government and the federal member states collaborate with each other in addressing the impacts of climate change. In addition, the civil society organizations, academia, and stakeholders play a vital role in addressing climate change. The federal government works very closely with all the relevant institutions at the federal and federal member states in formulating of the policies and designing the implementation of the projects and programs regarding on this matter. At the international level, Somalia is a member of listed development countries and requires both financial and technical assistance. The government collaborates with international partners and UN agencies in the designing and implementation of programs and projects. In this regard, country has been implementing many important projects and aimed to protect environment and climate change. So those are some areas that I just wanted to highlight, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. So it's clear that we need to step up the action at so many different levels. So let me check the time. We've got 40 minutes, and I want to use these last 40 minutes to really focus on how we really increase the level of action. We've taken baby steps so far. We need a quantum leap, right? You know, we've heard a lot about the experience that what the barriers are, what the challenges are. We really need to start thinking how we work differently, how we raise the awareness, particularly with, you know, non-climate actors or sort of non-climate specialists, how we build the evidence, because many, you know, hide behind the evidence gap, how we document the experiences that we heard about to continue to build on what has worked. So I'm going to start, I'll do another round of panelists, but I'll come to the audience as well. I want to hear, you know, the ideas to really move towards this quantum leap for action, how we close this action gap. That's the title of the panel. And I'm going to ask, first of all, to start Nick Dyer, who should also appear on screen. Nick is the UK Special Envoy for Famine Prevention and Humanitarian Affairs. So, Nick, you have, you know, vast experience of thinking about this, in particular over the past 2 years. You've dedicated a lot of time to really think how we can prepare and respond to climate impact better and scale up what we're doing so far. What should we do to really take the action to another level?
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. And when you were laying out your list of things that we failed to do or we should be doing more of in the last 20 years, and I would add more conversations like this where we're bringing partner countries, researchers, and the different communities together. And I just don't think there's enough conversations like that. And you're right. I mean, I've been doing this job now for the best part of a year. And over that time, there's been a 50% increase in the number of people who now need humanitarian support. And it is staggering. There are 250 million people globally who are in humanitarian need now. And that's in part because of conflict, but also because of the compound impacts of COVID, but also of climate change. And as Robert was saying that he saw in Mali, and I've seen multiple times in my travels how climate impacts are just exacerbating the humanitarian problems people are facing. And in Jonglei State in South Sudan, where huge flooding was just adding to the displacement and people's ability to be able to respond. We've seen droughts in Somalia, we've seen terrible locust infestations across the whole of East Africa. and we've now got a drought-driven famine going on in Madagascar. And the key issue for all of us, not just the humanitarian community, is not only how do we sort of prioritise our limited resources and protect people, but it's also how we can prevent these increasingly severe and frequent natural disasters from just dragging more people into the humanitarian net. And the reality is that we just have to start doing things and conceptualizing things like humanitarian aid differently. And we all know, and we've said it, a number of people have said it here, I mean, there's really sort of compelling evidence that if we can anticipate shocks, agree financing that is pre-arranged, and have those in place in advance of shocks happening and release them when the shocks do happen, then you can get a more dignified and hard-won development gains from that kind of anticipatory action. And this is all about how we plan and respond to forecast shocks, and how we make sure that the money's in place to deliver that response. And I think there's some really good examples that are happening now where this is being put in place. And we heard from the DG in Somalia. And Somalia is a good example where the OCHA, the SURF, have used their funding to put in place a mechanism by which, when a forecast of a drought happens, then there is the triggering in advance of resources on investments in things like rehabilitating boreholes or repairing shallow wells, or providing drought-tolerant seeds and tools. And we've seen this happen. And I suppose my key point here is that these are interventions that have been funded by the humanitarian community, but could just as easily be funded by the adaptation community under climate finance. And I think there is a much more nuanced conversation that we need to have about how we can get different types of funding into these spaces to be able to scale up this kind of activity. Because the reality is that the humanitarian community is not going to be able to do this at scale, but the adaptation community could. And we have in the UK, I mean, we've committed to do more and work in more ways to prevent and anticipate future crises. And we've been putting more resources into the UN. We've been working with the Red Cross and civil society to support more locally led approaches, and we've been funding work on forecast-based financing. So we can do all of this work, but it's at a reasonably small and modest scale at the moment. But we know that this kind of anticipatory action can make a big difference. And we committed through the G7 in the Compact for Famine Prevention and Humanitarian Affairs to do more work in the anticipatory action space. And I know that Germany is thinking more how to take this forward as they take their presidency, or as they start thinking about their presidency, G7 presidency for next year. But I just wanted to sort of just finish, Sarah, on a couple of things that other people have said, which I think is really important. And it's not only about what we do in the fragile and conflict-affected states, but it's also how we do it. And all the lessons from development, and Sukenya was saying this, and others were saying this, and the ministers and the DG was also saying this, is it's not only about instruments, it's also about how do you build institutions, and how do you build on ingenuity. And this is about how you can invest in state capability and how you help governments to do their preparation and their response and their planning. It's how, as Sukenya said, it's not about easy actions that one size fits all. It's about being realistic in terms of our expectations, but also it's about building on the solutions and the ideas that actually are held in communities and individuals who on a day-to-day basis see, suffer and respond to climate change. and creating the space to empower those people to sort of co-create the solutions and to build knowledge and systems and the evidence base are the pathways that we need to be able to get action going forward. So I'd say this is about instruments, it's about institutions, and it's about ingenuity, and we need to scale up all three. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Nick. I could not agree more with you. I mean, these are two of my hobby horses in terms of how we change the kind of tools and instruments in context that end up using humanitarian instruments because they're considered too risky to use different instruments. The reason why we don't get adaptation financing in countries that are affected by conflict is because it's seen too insecure, and so we try to then try and tailor humanitarian tools that are not really fit for purpose because that is seen as a humanitarian context. That's a long-standing issue, and we really need to, get better at going beyond that, particularly because, as you say, it's the how we do things, because then that ends up leaving behind the co-creation, with governments and communities that actually adaptation instruments put much more at the center. So actually, with that, I'll come to Sukaina because, Nick, in a way, has invited you quite nicely to tell us more about how you think we can improve these tools and instruments. This is really, it's not even an elephant in the room. We know that is a problem. But how do we really move concretely beyond making sure that we develop tools that are finally fit for purpose?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Nick, for allowing me to chip in. I would think about two examples: one in terms of financing, and then in terms of analytics. So, in terms of financing, we are boosting significantly our support to climate adaptation and emphasizing early action and crisis preparedness. If you look at our climate action plan, for countries dealing with fragility, conflict, and violence, we are prioritizing resilience building with a particular focus on the nexus of climate and other risks to better understand the likelihood and impact of that risk. And an important part of our agenda here is also to ensure that preparedness and early action are front and center in the priorities of countries where fragility and limited capacity hinder government response to climate-related shock. And in particular, we are preparing to scale up our investments in the crisis preparedness agenda, which is going to be a cross-cutting issue as a priority in the forthcoming IDA 20. But of course, finance is important, but finance alone is not the solution. So we are also building a strong analytical base at the global and country level, including by introducing what we call the Country Climate and Development Report, CCDR, that address the interplay between climate and development. So CCDRs will be used to inform, prioritize, and sequence climate action through the country engagement process, and thus help us implement the climate action plan. We are also, as a second point under this analytic, focusing on understanding better the relationship between FCV and climate change and its implications for operational outcomes in FCV countries. Our instrument that I referred earlier to, which is our risk and resilience assessment, offers a systematic analysis of the underlying drivers of vulnerability and fragility, which helps inform the design and delivery of proactive approaches. For instance, talking about the Sahel, we have, in addition to having risk and resilience assessment for individual countries, we had an analytic risk and resilience assessment for the whole Sahel. We're developing one for the Horn of Africa that allows us to take into account the cross-border element of risk, compounding risk, including climate risk. So to improve our understanding of the global landscape of risk, we are developing as well a compound risk monitor. The early warning system gathers real-time information on risk related to a different range of threats, highlighting potential hotspots of compound risk up to 12 months ahead. So let me stop here and really look forward to hearing other perspectives and thoughts from other panelists as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Sukaina. That's very helpful. I was also thinking about, again, some of the labels that we have around the funding can actually really inhibit the ability of countries to access certain types of funding. I think that's part of the challenge, because if you want to really access adaptation funding, for a fragile and conflict-affected state is not easy. There are eligibility criteria that get in the way, of accessing climate finance if the state institutional performance is low. Or, many of these countries lack the data that are required for, GCF or GEF funding, I don't know, like climate observations and projections, or the amount of carbon a given project will sequester, and so forth. So there are some tangible barriers that need to be removed if we really want to make progress in making sure that a variety of instruments can be used, to address the challenges that countries that are affected by both, fragility and conflict, and, are exposed to climate risk, can benefit from these flows. So, Mick, I'm going to come to you to, propose what we can do to really make sure that we move beyond these labels. We have action that more concretely can help countries, have a greater access to these funding flows, and action that is more joined up.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Can you hear me? Sarah, can you hear me now? Great. Thank you, Sarah. Sorry?
The mic is counterintuitive. When the light is off, it's on.
It's a bit tricky. Yeah, but you're actually completely right that the funding mechanisms are typically set up for specific mandates, and for us in the UNFCCC system, it's focused on climate change and adaptation and mitigation and other climate aspects. But of course, if we look at the real world out there, people are facing these compound risks that we've been talking about today, and climate change is only one of them. So we need to remove unnecessary silos in a way, and to make funding available to countries and their communities in a way that is comprehensive and flexible. When we're talking about risk, I just wanted to build on what was said by the earlier speakers, that we are talking about the continuum in a way, that we are trying to mitigate risk. In the case of the Adaptation Fund, we're trying to mitigate the risk from climate change, which is longer-term risk, and then in the case of other actors, it may be more focused on the shorter scale risk. But then we are also dealing with different kinds of risks during project implementation, which may be related to conflict, for example, and related phenomena. The regional projects that we fund are actually a way of trying to mitigate the risk of conflict between countries on natural resources in particular, and we've been funding those around ecosystems in different parts of the world related to water bodies and others, which are, as we know, very sensitive in many cases in terms of risk. One of the main constraints in FCV situation countries is absorption capacity, and that is something that makes funding often challenging due to the operating context and the fact that adequate support may not be available in those specific circumstances. Also, the executing and operating entities of climate finance are typically large multilateral organizations that are or specialized entities which may have limited capacity in terms of dealing with in such situations. Of course, for us, looking at how we can make sure that our projects and programs continue in conflict situations, I mean, we need to balance different priorities. The ultimate goal, of course, for us is to help communities in developing countries become more resilient to impacts of climate change. But at the same time, while we are at that, we can't jeopardize the health and safety of the people who are working for those longer-term goals. So we need to be very mindful of the situation, and sometimes this has an effect on the timeline and content of the projects that we are funding. And it's actually an interesting case that during the pandemic, as we've been kind of in a conflict with this virus globally, if you will, and we've been trying to mitigate, to address these two challenges, climate change and the pandemic, at the same time. we've had to, and we've done our best in adjusting the ongoing projects so that, for example, when we know that we can't implement them in the same speed as we would normally do, and there may be need to move around some contents of the project, we've been trying to do that and to be flexible so that the countries are able to do that. And I think that would be probably the same situation in conflict situations, so that you need to be kind of flexible in order to be able to address the specific circumstances that you face in different phases of conflict. Also, implementation tends to become more expensive, more costly in those situations, and we should pay attention to how we include flexibility in our financial caps, for example, so that we enable those projects and programs to be flexible in terms of the funding that they receive and how they use it. Finally, I'd like to mention that so far the focus on international finance has been on these multilateral implementing entities, but we as the Adaptation Fund for a bit more than 10 years have been financing projects through national agencies, which is a new way of, I would say, of giving countries more ownership of the climate finance that they access. They can do that directly from the Adaptation Fund using their own national entities, and we have 34 of them at the moment and counting. It's also important to build in the capacity to deal with conflict situations in those national organizations. So not only in the international ones, but also in the national and regional organizations that finance climate finance. Thank you.
Thanks, Mikko. I'll have a bit of a provocation. If we take further what you're saying, more flexible funding, more rooted funding, something that really responds to the needs of the community, it just requires a complete overhaul of the funding frameworks that we have at the moment. This is a big debate in the humanitarian community. How to make sure that our funding is really responding to local needs, is driven by local priorities, to the person that is affected by risks, whether it's climate, conflict. They don't really care where the money is coming from, or where the best action to support them, who is providing it. They just want to make sure that their priorities guide, these actions. So I'll come to Robert, because we just had this discussion a couple of weeks ago, actually, in another debate. How do we really make sure that these local priorities are at the heart of how we shape the programming and rethink the funding flows, Robert? Because ultimately, we continue to have these conversations, but we're really struggling to make that change, the serious change that is required to support locally driven responses seriously.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And building on the many good elements previous speakers raised, I think simply put, here's a problem. Conflict-affected countries are the most vulnerable to climate change, and therefore they should be prioritized in terms of climate finance. But at the end of the day, they are the most neglected. And we spoke of all the risk, the contextual risk, weak institutions, access requirement, programmatic modalities. But we have many of those gaps where we all agree, but they are today largely unaddressed. And I think that climate action in these locations is absolutely critical to reduce humanitarian needs, to preserve development gains, to avoid systemic breakdown of essential services. And I think that the step we need to make, if you want to have a meaningful local action that will help build the resilience of communities, there is a need for a greater tolerance to risk here. This is the big elephant in the room, and the very mechanisms of access to climate finance in conflict and fragile situations most probably need to be revisited. We also need to find ways to ensure that climate adaptation is adequately supported at the local level, notably. And here I agree with what Nick said. The humanitarian community alone cannot take its action to scale. The adaptation community alone neither, and it's only through enabling the diversification of multiple partners and ensuring complementary approaches that we can maybe start to make a change. And I think the key word here is really enabling the diversification of partners to be addressing those chronic problems. And we can combine this with one of the commitments of the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organization, which is to really embrace the leadership of local actors and communities. So how to do this? We need, I think, and here I concur with what was said before about changing the way we work. We need to listen to people. We need to follow their lead, and we need to take the time to do this properly. And this really requires making the time, making all the efforts to understand the communities we work with. And even in the same country, this varies from one community to the other because of the very specific needs, specific conflict dynamics and specific constraints. So again, here, no one size fits all. And again, I saw this in Mali once more at the local level. There is no shortage, and we should not underestimate, no shortage of resolve to find ways to cope with a changing climate. Local actors and people need to be really involved in a meaningful and inclusive manner in the whole chain of any project, in the design, in the management, in the implementation and evaluation of programs. We need to take the time to learn from local, traditional and indigenous knowledge on migration and on adaptation measures, including nature-based solution. And I think this is really the only way to get it right. And support from the international community here is really needed. Now, on the diversification question, there are significant differences between crises in terms of scales, drivers, strengths of institution and governance. Therefore, there are also significant differences in terms of solutions from one crisis to another. So diversifying the types and sizes of organizations eligible for support could really help strengthening climate action at all levels. That is to say that we need to support small-scale community-driven programming that is informed by local knowledge and experience, and not only, and this is a temptation very often, focus on large-scale projects. And again, in places where government structures are maybe weak or absent, this is particularly and absolutely critical. And complementarity and the multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral engagement is obviously key to ultimately ensure comprehensive responses. And maybe let me conclude by insisting again that we need to join forces to do better. And this requires rethinking some of our ways of working and partnering, including within the humanitarian community, where we need to do much more and better than what we do today. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Robert. Some excellent points that are really taking us towards some, a good list of things that we can try and push for these next 10 days of COP in terms of, real steps. I want to also hear from, very, very briefly from the audience. But before I come to you, in 1 minute, I'm going to ask, both Ahmed and the minister. One thing we haven't talked about is actually the support to NAPs and NDCs, how we can also make sure that there is real support to the implementation of the NAPs and the NDCs in the context of this double challenge. Ahmed, what can we do to be more meaningful in the support that is provided to a government like Somalia?
Thank you, Sarah, for asking me also that question. I think successfully and timely implementation of NDCs requires the involvement of strong institutions able to develop and implement effective adaptation and mitigation policies. And the effective and also the components of the enabling environment. In general, like Somalia, institutions both national and sub-national levels suffer from a considerable deficiency in human, financial, organizational, and institutional capacity to manage the environment and natural resources and to respond to the specific challenges that climate change brought to Somalia. Therefore, we call partners in humanitarian development and adaptation sectors can support fragile countries like Somalia in the capacity building and technology transfer, financial needs for adaptation and mitigation undertakings. This will enhance Somalia ownership of NAP and NDC and move forward the effective implementation of country commitments as well as the implementation of national adaptation plan. So as I mentioned now, that the capacity building and technology are one of the key important issues that I think that the fragile countries need is to be supported so that they can respond to the climate crisis. If there is no capacity, you can't do anything at all in climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I ask the Minister to conclude, and Rebecca, do you have any also final concluding point, actually? So I want the Minister to conclude, but first I want to bring you and the audience.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I think I just wanted to pick up on what Robert said about the elephant in the room, about risk tolerance. I mean, that is such a critical point. How we or one perceives something to be risky is very much a value-laden judgment. And I think it's really important that we actually start by having these type of conversations to actually really understand what is it that is perceived as a threat to a particular country, a particular area, and then how we can address that. And I think so often we come to the COPs and we say climate's going to have a serious impact. We outline, we do a very descriptive discussion of the problem, but we don't actually sort of get to the crux of that and actually sit down and hear and say, right, we hear the problems in Niger, we hear the problems in Somalia, what are we going to do about that? And I think, Miko, you touched on it when you said, we have these different groupings in this political process of LDC and so on. But for a long time, we've known that a number of countries are in fragile and conflict affected areas. But yet, that's not taken into consideration, within the UNFCCC. So again, we need to actually stand up and say, yes, this is a complex situation to address. But actually, we can't keep putting our head in the sand, and actually we're going to have to face it. So if we really want to tackle the action gap, we actually have to act. We can't just sit around saying we need to take action. So yeah, that's my thought for the day.
Great. Anyone from the audience? How do we close the action gap? What are you taking from this discussion? Yes, take the floor, identify yourself, and really 30 seconds.
Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Alex Tarzakan, and I work for Northwestern University in Chicago. So my question is kind of on the lines of action, more specifically looking at the mandate of the UN Security Council. So in September, there was an open dialogue at the UN CS on climate security. And all current council members do recognize the threat of climate change. However, there are divisions on whether or not the UN Security Council should be addressing climate change and security. So my question is, should this fall under the UNSC's mandate? And if so, what concrete actions can the UN Security Council take on this issue?
Okay, we'll see if someone is happy to take the question, perhaps actually after we close, because what I really want to get from the audience is some ideas on how we close the action gap. It's no time for question. We really have only like 7 minutes before we close the debate, but I'd like to invite others that may have reflections on what else we can do concretely on the back of your experience. But if there isn't, we can just, yes, please, lady here, if you can pass the mic. I'll come to you at the back.
Stuck on my earring. Jen Abdella, I'm with the Nereus Foundation. We work in Mali, so I've been very interested to hear the reflections on what observations folks make. I think one of the most important things is to get beyond the silos of humanitarian development, adaptation, as you said, Sarah. People experience risk and they experience vulnerability without discerning whether it's because of conflict or because of poverty or development deficits or a humanitarian crisis. And all of those things are very much interlinked in a fragile context. So I think thinking really seriously about moving beyond those silos, moving towards action, and doing it in a way where we're putting local actors at the core of identifying what the needs are and how we make those investments is where we have to go. The idea that anyone from outside should be coming in and doing something is really counterproductive, and it creates all kinds of dependencies and maladaptations that are really counterproductive, I think.
Thank you very much. I see Siobhan behind the mask at the back. Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Well, it's Sinead, but I'm used to answering to Siobhan, Sarah. So 50% of the time, that's what I get. Thanks, colleagues. It was fascinating. I work on climate for the Government of Ireland. Also very interested in that Security Council question, but maybe for another day. One reflection to try to answer your question, Sarah, about how we can do better. I think, I take the point that was just made and the point that was made by panelists about, locally led action, and that should be in the front, and I fully agree with that. But international organizations will inevitably have staff on the ground. And in my experience in fragile states, which is kind of all of my experience, frankly, in South Sudan and other contexts, international organizations really struggle to get the right people on the ground because it's difficult to incentivize, people. And when we talk about the complexity of the issues that colleagues have talked about today, you really need your best people. These are the most difficult contexts. But they're also the most difficult context for international organizations to get, the people with, the sort of that level of analytical capacity and so on. So I think as international organizations, apart from, supporting local level adaptation and so on, and that's maybe a conversation for another day that many of us are involved in, I think we also need to look at how we incentivize, to recognize that these complicated contexts need and deserve the best people that we can give them, and therefore how do we incentivize that and make it easier for that to happen, because I think that's one of the challenges, and it's a conversation I've actually had with the World Bank in the past in terms of some of their offices, but I think it's really common to all of our organizations. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sinead, and apologies for getting your name wrong. And yes, final comment. Yeah, I'm afraid we really need to close. If you're very brief, I'll take one more.
I'll try to be brief. My name is Anna. I'm from the IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development. And my question is, building on what Jen was saying about these, and several panelists as well, about the silos between humanitarian adaptation and development action, is bringing in loss and damage into the conversation. The panelists spoke about compounding risks, about displacement, about migration, about many of these things that come under the umbrella of loss and damage. And so I think it's really important for humanitarian actors to define and identify what role they can play in advocating for loss and damage finance within the UNFCCC and outside of it. I'll finish there in the hopes that there's time for the other person to ask their question.
Thank you, Hannah. Some excellent questions. I'm not sure we'll have time to address them, but let's see. One final comment there, please.
Sam Bickersteth from the policy practice, and congratulations to ODI in putting the political executive and the technocratic and donor organizations into one panel. But we're not naming really the need for the donor organizations to really embed thinking and working politically and political economy into this. We talk about the institutions, we've not really got to the actors, neither we got to the issues of incentives. So until we really do that, is behavior really going to change?
Thanks. We'll actually conclude with the donor, but I want to actually ask the minister if he has any final, very brief reflection for us that we can take with us, and then I'll wrap up the panel, wrap up the discussion, and give the floor to Rakia Williams as well, who's the deputy head of the FCDO COP26 Delivery Department. But let's first hear from the minister.
Merci beaucoup, madame. J'ai suivi avec attention toutes les interventions.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I really follow with interest what you have said.
Et j'ai eu 3 points qui coïncident avec les miens.
And really, I noticed 3.
Le premier point, le premier point est le financement de l'adaptation.
The first point is the financing of adaptation. Point is the second point is capacity enforcement.
Le troisième point, c'est l'implication des structures et personnes locales.
The third point is the implication of local actors.
En réalité, les 3 correspondent à ma conclusion. Au Niger, nous avons un programme qui a la résilience principale.
Niger has a program that's really based on resilience.
C'est pourquoi nous avons toujours pointé dans le domaine humanitaire le salut.
It will not be easy with the international organizations there on ground. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. And actually, I think what the Minister has concluded just brings together what has been the focus of the discussion today. You know, the heart of what is needed in Niger is this focus on resilience in partnership with the humanitarian actors on the ground, looking at 3 elements: financing adaptation, strengthening capacity, and making sure the local action, local structures are really at the heart. This is really, you know, I couldn't have said it better. Thank you so much. I hope that we've heard so many excellent points in terms of how we can further the action. I'm going to hand over to Rakia Williams in a second, who will sum up some of the key points. Also because I think this can really help, you know, I'm hoping, be further considered and discussed throughout this COP, and particularly in the Adaptation, Resilience and Loss and Damage Day, which is the 8th of November. And Raki is going to tell us more about it. Thanks, Raki.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to all the panelists today and to Sarah for facilitating such an interesting discussion. I feel very delighted with the range of panelists we've had here today, but I'm been particularly delighted to have the voices of friends from the government of Niger and Somalia, and they're 2 regions particularly close to my heart. And I think it was working for the UK government in Nigeria and Somalia where I really, truly, I think, understood the multidimensional angle of what we've talked about today. Climate meets conflict, meets humanitarian, meets development. So for me in Nigeria, it was thinking about the middle belt where you have farmers and herders with conflict, with climate-driven issues with access to grazing, driving conflict. And in Somalia, as we've heard from Nick, it's about successive rainy seasons that are failing, leading to drought, leading to displacement. And I think what I can say is that the UK government, in those contexts and beyond, is approaching these issues with a conflict-sensitive approach, an approach that's looking at the so-called nexus between humanitarian and development. We're looking at an approach where it's about relative financing, and we're also thinking about an approach that's very much working with local actors. And I think there was a comment earlier about the fact that we should not be doing it to these communities, but very much with. Which brings me on to Adaptation, Loss and Damage Day, which will be happening a week today, on the 8th of November, ALD Day. And perhaps to put it in context, I can just very briefly talk about the UK presidency approach to adaptation. So yesterday, the UK was delighted to launch the Glasgow Imperative for Adaptation, which you can find online. And that was as the COP26 president. And we believe that delivering change will require everyone at COP26, and including those looking to COP27, to advocate for a fundamental transformation of economic activity to address the types of injustices and inequalities that we've heard about today from the whole panelists. And I think what we've heard today is also that the vulnerability is obviously more stark in conflict-affected areas and fragile states. So Glasgow, for us, the UK presidency, is the moment to build a movement to drive change. And as the Glasgow Imperative sets out, the UK presidency will be playing our part by delivering change through 5 pillars. And those pillars are building resilience across all of society, effective risk management, and I think and finally harnessing the power of nature. So the initiative that we've been championing as the UK presidency is very much about empowering local actors to collectively shift from a series of moments on adaptation, loss and damage to a movement focused on the type of action that very clearly we've needed here today. So Adaptation, Loss and Damage Day puts this into focus, and we'll have 4 flagship events setting out the challenge, the scale of the challenge, convening leaders, and those convening leaders from various sectors: government, youth, citizens, partnerships, scientists, NGOs, working across our 5 pillars of change. And the flagship events to close are Hearing from the Front Line, which is about very much hearing from grassroots representatives who are at the front line of climate change. And we want to close the gap between those who predominantly attend COP and those for whom it is for. We also have an Adaptation, Loss and Damage Ministerial Roundtable, so we have 20 ministers from across the world participating, and that's about challenging the status quo, making new commitments, sharing best practice on how to close the vulnerability gap, very much learning and progressing from the events here today. We have Experiencing Loss and Damage, which many people talked about today, including someone from the audience, and that's about an innovative discussion on the critical issue seeking to close the gap on the fact that we have various and divergent voices on the topic of loss and damage, and the UK presidency wants to create an open floor for us to air those views and discuss them collegiately. And finally, an adapted future, which really looks forward to COP27 and beyond, and focuses on the steps needed to close the vulnerability gap by 2035. And so I encourage all of you to join. It's open to Blue Zone participants. It's a week today, and all of it will be happening in Meeting Room 4 and the plenary room. So I'll pass back over to Sarah, but thank you so much for your work today.
Thank you so much, Raki. I hope that tonight's discussion will assist in driving the issue forward and inform the work of the UK COP presidency during the coming year. With that, I ask all of you to join me to thank our wonderful panelists, both in the room and Nick, Robert, and Sukena online. You will agree with me that this was an incredibly rich discussion with a lot of food for thought. And now it's time to close that action gap and go back there and try and make it happen. But thank you very much.